Today we're going to be talking about another infamously poor game release. This is Spider-Man 3, the movie tie-in game, and also the sequel to one of the best superhero games ever made for the sixth generation, Spider-Man 2. Now, it's fair to say that this sequel had a good amount of hype following it. Spider-Man 2 came out and kind of shined a light on just how much fun an open-world superhero game could be, and playing it back day on the PS2, which was my experience, I lost many hours just exploring and having a good time within that world. However, I never played Spider-Man 3 back when it was new. It came out and it was almost notoriously panned as not just being one of the most massive disappointments during its time, but one of the worst games ever made. Now, how does this happen? How do you miss the mark so much that you take a game which already had a pretty solid foundation and was heralded at the time as being just super fun and super addicting? How do you then develop a sequel that feels so poor to play, and not only that, but looks so outdated and even more so, runs so poorly? Like, there's this huge list of problems here, and you don't even have to look far to recognize them. Now, I want to go through and list exactly what the issue is here and talk about my experience playing Spider-Man 3 for the very first time, so please bear with me. Now, as I said before, I played Spider-Man 2 back on the PS2, and not only that, but the original Spider-Man as well on both the PS2 and the original PlayStation. So I am no stranger to these games and the quality of what they used to be, and how sort of Activision took the brand and ran it through the mud, and the inconsistent releases made afterwards by Beenox before the game's inevitable purchase by Sony today. This game follows the plot line of the Sam Raimi Spider-Man 3 release, a film that at the time I remember quite liking, but in retrospect feels pretty rushed and just overall a much weaker sequel in comparison to the earlier films, which I think still hold up well today. There seems to be countless stories about the nature of why the third film turned out the way that it did, so I'm not going to touch on that here, but the game is sort of a different story because at the time it just felt like nothing could go wrong. You have a brand new generation of consoles. Spider-Man 2 was one of the best releases back in the day, and you also had Treyarch returning to develop this entry, at least specifically the next generation versions of the game, but now things are starting to come into the light. You remember back when I discussed Call of Duty 3, I talked about Treyarch being hyper mistreated by Activision, and I mean they were only given a year to build a full-fledged Call of Duty game back then. And I think what we have here is the result of a studio being overly developed, not given enough resources to manage their projects, and just not enough time to complete everything. Spider-Man 3's plot in the game feels like it goes in 1,000 different directions and ends up nowhere. They added a bunch to the story that wasn't present in the movie, so while it does land on some of the same beats and the major plot points of the original film, the game takes things sideways, round and up again until you feel so turned around that you start to question what the story even entailed to begin with. Now, it's hard to list many of the plot points here, but we have added factions, added villains, added side characters, and all this just bloats the plot to what many would argue was already a bloated plot from the film. And it's just extremely nauseating to try and get a handle on exactly what is happening here, and it's obnoxious to even sit through and watch it all unfold. Now, supporting this excuse for a plot is an even worse gameplay dynamic. We have a myriad of issues here, starting with one of the worst cameras I have ever played with in a video game. The camera attempts to track the player movement, but is about as fidgety as someone with ADHD. Now, kudos to all of you who haven't looked away from this video footage, because if you think the web slinging may induce motion sickness to someone, the combat is even worse. There are missions in this game that take place in enclosed spaces. For example, I was fighting in the sewers, and I couldn't even begin to recall the amount of times the camera would get locked into a wall, turn violently to try and capture the enemy I was fighting with, or just overall not respond or respond too quickly to the movements I was making with the analog stick. I even at one moment had to look away, and it just gets dragged from left to right. It's as if like there's some type of long rope attached to the camera and someone is jostling twirling it around, playing with it like a puppet on strings. It's terrible. But it gets even worse. The controls are just on another level of bad. Unresponsiveness is the name of the game here, and you can conduct combos against enemies, but you'd have a hard time even trying to get a grasp on what your inputs are doing, as well as how Spider-Man is just reacting or not reacting at all. Sometimes it's delayed to what you're pressing. Now, the big point was that the web's attached to buildings in this game, but it feels more like you're just being slingshotted from one end to the next. Really with no control, or rather too much control. Everything just sort of comes across as vapid. This makes traversal a pain and a chore to practice. All elements of Spider-Man 3's gameplay fails, and it's just the combat, it's the traversal, it's the camera system. They all fall apart here, and the best thing I could say about this game is it's short enough to the point where even if you have the balls to force yourself through it like I did, I actually completed this game, but you'll finish it quickly enough before you want to break the disc in half. There's just no saving grace when it comes to the plot, the gameplay, and unfortunately even the technical components as well. But first, let's take a look at the Spider-Man 3 box art on Xbox 360. It's a fairly simplistic cover here, but I do like it. You have the Spider-Man font on the side there, which is kind of indicative of the PlayStation 3 box art, which is kind of interesting. There's a look at the spine there, pretty simple. And then we have a couple of screenshots here with the big, number 3 in the center. And I like the official movie game little badge they have on the left side. So that's pretty cool. Let's take a look inside the case here. We got a simplistic game disc. Again, this game does not support Xbox Live features, hence the lack of Xbox Live branding. So we have that, and then we have a manual here, and it's pretty simplistic. It's black and white, but it kind of fits the themes being, of Spider-Man's sort of black suit, the symbiote suit. So that's pretty cool, but you have information about controls. There's different information about the different campaign modes of the game, support information and stuff like that. So pretty much all there is to it. And then an ad for another Spider-Man game, Friend or Foe, coming out later that year. So pretty cool look at the box art. Graphically here, we have a poor excuse of a next-generation game. Now, one could say it's open world. It was early in the generation. They had to make do with what they had, and fine. But I've played other open world games on this channel from this era, and I've reviewed them here, and this may just be one of the worst-looking ones yet. This game was traded off to different developers to develop different versions of the game. So those of you who played it on a last-gen system like the PS2 or original Xbox, or even those of you who played the handheld versions, got a completely different game from a completely different studio versus what Treyarch did here on the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 versions, which is the true version. It's funny because Sony also used this game as a tech demo to demonstrate at the time realistic character rendering for the upcoming PlayStation 3, and what we saw in that tech demo wasn't even indicative of what I'm showing you here. Now, not only that, but the 360 version specifically actually has more detail than the PS3 version. This comes down to additional foliage, meshes, traffic. So what you're seeing right now is really the best the game will ever look. It's bad. Not only does it look this poor, but the frame rate is even poorer. The game runs in the mid-20s for long stretches of gameplay and has dips into the teens, and you combine the judder with the rapid camera movements and the unresponsive controls, and you get a game here that feels almost at times unplayable. There is such a substantial lack of polish in everything that it's hard to even surmise how this was given a green light at all to release. It feels like at times that this game was an early alpha, and because the movie came out, they didn't have enough time to finish developing the game, and Activision was just like, yeah, ship it now. Oh boy. Well, let's move on to audio now, and things don't really get much better here either. They kind of steal, or should I say borrow, the music from the movies, which is phenomenal, by the way. The main theme of Sam Raimi's Spider-Man movies feels very iconic and is just super well done in my opinion. I love orchestrated soundtracks, so that's present here in the game, but you couple that with some hilariously awful voice acting, and oh my god. Tobey Maguire returns. In fact, most of the actors actually return to reprise their roles for their characters here, and you gotta wonder if this was actually in their contract when they did the film, like they had to voice the game as well when they were doing the movie. But yeah, whatever audio equipment that they were using to actually record the dialogue, everyone sounds like they're recording this from like the company bathroom or something. It sounds awful. The mixing, the reverb, the echoing, it just sounds bad. Barely any of the lines here are delivered with care or finesse, and it just feels like a rush job all around. Environmental sounds are actually even worse. Sometimes you won't even get a sound for some of the objects or effects, but the punching sound effect feels like just generic punch sound number 32 being used over and over and over again. It's repetitive, it provokes insanity, and just adds a cherry on top of this shit sundae it already is. You know, while recording this reminiscing video, I was thinking back to when I talked about Sonic 2006 about a month ago, and I think at the end of that video, I made a mistake of making it sound like it was some sort of duty of mine to play these poor games and review them for context or experience on reviewing games. It's almost as if it gave my opinion some sort of authority because this wider experience gave my conclusions more merit. I didn't exactly feel good about the way I worded that ending segment, and playing yet another infamously poor game here, I wanted to take this opportunity to both correct myself and apologize if it sort of came across that way. I happened on a tweet a few days ago, and someone had asked what was the worst game you ever played. And in the thread, in the replies, I was disappointed to see that there were a lot of newer, more modern titles people were referencing. Now, some people did post some older titles as well, but there was a decent lot who referenced games that came out only a few years ago, and even some that came out just a couple months ago. But one of the games that someone mentioned in the thread really had me scratching my head. Someone mentioned the game Deathloop as being the worst game that they ever played. Now, you can imagine the responses that comment got, but I was thinking to myself, what a blessing it must be for a game such as Deathloop to be the worst game you have ever played. I mean, just think about that. If that's where the bar is set, then imagine what few games would be considered good or even great. For me, I just find it very interesting to go back and play these games, and I think that public opinion shouldn't garner or influence one's mentality on the art itself. Like, if you want an opinion on a piece of art, then you must experience that art, watching that movie, playing that game, seeing that painting in a museum, whatever the case may be. I think that personal experience is so important. And we have a danger right now of people hijacking conversations and turning them into sort of screaming matches just to perpetuate whatever agenda that they have, whether it's political, fanboyism, or just the need to belong to something. But for me specifically, I really subscribe to the idea that if you want to play something, then play it. Regardless of what the reception may be, don't let yourself be influenced by the discourse online or the reviewers. You know, you guys know what I like, you know my preferences, and I have a long history of reviewing games of all sorts of styles and genres and coming to my own conclusions on all of them. But I still feel that everyone should experience things for themselves on their own. It's just something that's very important to me, and these days I never watch reviews for any game or any movie that I want to see or play. I just like sort of going in with as open of a mindset as possible, and it's something that I really value. You know, you only get your first experience once. It can't ever happen again. So I really put an emphasis on valuing having that experience being as untainted by popular opinion or online discourse as possible. So that's the point that I kind of wanted to get across with sort of my ending segment when I talked about Sonic 2006, and it kind of came up again because this is also an infamously poor, release, one that was just completely panned and is considered one of the worst games ever made. And, people might wonder, like, why even subject yourself to that? But that's just how my brain sort of works. I want to experience things for myself and come to my own conclusions and see, was it really truly that bad, or are people just over exaggerating things and just, coming to their own conclusions or borrowing other people's conclusions and just echoing the same, idea over and over and over again. It's just something that's quite, interesting to me. But for now, thank you all so much for watching this video. Hope you all have a fantastic day. Please let me know what you think of Spider-Man 3 if you played it, and I'll see you guys for the next Reminiscing video. Have a good one.